She knew the exact moment her old life would walk through that door. She just didn't know it would be today. Claret Elise Monroe pressed the silver espresso machine's steam wand with practiced precision, watching the milk foam rise like tiny clouds in the ceramic pitcher. The morning rush at Bruin Page's was always the same. Hurried office workers clutching their phones, college students with dark circles under their eyes, and the occasional neighborhood regular who actually remembered her fake name. "Emmy, table 6 is still waiting," called Marcus from behind the register, his voice cutting through the gentle hum of conversation and clinking spoons. "Got it," she replied, her voice steady but soft. 3 years of hiding behind someone else's name had taught her to speak just loud enough to be heard, but never enough to be remembered. The cafe was her sanctuary, a small, warm space in Park Slope with exposed brick walls, mismatched vintage chairs, and the kind of lighting that made everyone look like they belonged in an old photograph. She'd chosen this place deliberately. It was the opposite of everything she used to be: corporate, polished, ambitious. Here she could disappear into the rhythm of grinding beans and wiping tables, her ash-brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the same black apron that had become her uniform and her shield. She carried the cappuccino to table 6, where a woman in her 50s sat reading a paperback romance novel. The customer looked up with a smile that reminded Claret of her mother. Before everything changed. "Thank you, dear. You always make it just right." Claret nodded, fighting the familiar tightness in her chest. Compliments still felt foreign, like clothes that didn't quite fit. She turned back toward the counter, but something made her pause. Through the large front window, she could see the street beginning to fill with the usual morning crowd. Joggers in expensive athletic wear, dog walkers with their perfectly groomed pets, professionals in tailored coats heading to the subway. And then she saw him. Ellis James Rain stood across the street, tall and unmistakable in his charcoal wool coat, hands buried deep in his pockets. He wasn't looking at the cafe. Not yet. But Claret knew that posture. The way he held his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head when he was thinking. She'd watched him from across conference rooms for months, memorizing the small details that made him human beneath his polished exterior. Her hands trembled as she gripped the empty cup tray. This isn't real. This can't be happening. But it was. Ellis lifted his head and his green eyes found the cafe window. Found her. For a moment, time stopped. The espresso machine's hissing faded. The conversations around her became white noise. Even her own heartbeat seemed to pause, as if her body remembered what it felt like to be seen, really seen, by someone who mattered. Then he started walking toward the door. Claret's training kicked in. The same survival instinct that had helped her through the worst nights of her depression. The same mechanism that had taught her to function when functioning felt impossible. She moved quickly to the back of the cafe, slipping into the small storage room behind the counter. "Emmy, you okay back there?" Marcus's voice drifted through the door. "Just checking inventory," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She pressed her back against the cool wall, surrounded by boxes of coffee beans and paper cups, and tried to breathe. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The technique Dr. Kemp had taught her. It usually worked. Today, it felt like trying to stop an avalanche with her bare hands. Through the thin wall, she could hear the cafe door chime. Heavy footsteps. A pause. Then Marcus's cheerful voice. "Good morning. What can I get started for you?" "Just a black coffee, please. Large." The voice was deeper than she remembered, but still careful, still measured, still Ellis. "Coming right up. Emmy usually handles the—" "Emmy?" Marcus called toward the storage room. Claret closed her eyes. 3 years of therapy, 3 years of medication, 3 years of learning to live with the weight of her choices. And now, in the space of 30 seconds, she felt like she was drowning again. But she wasn't the same person who had disappeared 3 years ago. She was still broken in places, still healing in others, but she had learned something important. She was stronger than her fear. She opened the storage room door and stepped back into her carefully constructed life. Ellis stood at the counter, and when he saw her, his expression shifted. Surprise, recognition, and something else she couldn't quite name. Claret, just her name. Not Emmy. Not the person she'd been pretending to be. Her real name, spoken like he'd been holding it in his mouth for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to set it free. She met his eyes, feeling the familiar flutter of panic mixed with something she'd almost forgotten. "Hope. That'll be $3.50, she said quietly. And in that moment she realized the most dangerous thing of all. She had never stopped waiting for him to find her. Some silences are louder than words, and Ellis had been living in one for 3 years. He took his black coffee to the corner table, the one with the wobbly leg that made everyone avoid it. But Ellis needed the distance, needed the excuse to stay longer without seeming obvious. His hands wrapped around the ceramic mug, absorbing its warmth while his mind raced through 1,000 things he wanted to say and couldn't. She's thinner. That was his first coherent thought. But still beautiful. Still her. Clarette moved behind the counter with the fluid efficiency of someone who had mastered the art of being invisible. She cleaned the espresso machine with methodical precision, her movements careful and deliberate. 3 years ago, she used to gesture when she talked, her hands painting pictures in the air as she explained her ideas. Now she kept them busy, controlled, safe. "Hey, Emmy," Marcus called out, completely oblivious to the tension crackling through the cafe. "Can you handle the morning cleanup? I need to run to the bank before it gets crazy." "Of course," she replied, her voice barely carrying across the room. Ellis watched her nod, watched her shoulders tense slightly at the fake name. He wondered how long she'd been hiding behind it, how many mornings she'd answered to someone else's identity just to avoid being found. The cafe began to empty as the morning rush faded into the quieter rhythm of mid-morning. A few freelancers with laptops claimed the larger tables, and an elderly man sat by the window reading the Times. Ellis remained at his corner table, nursing his coffee and trying to figure out how to bridge 3 years of silence. She was wiping down tables now, moving closer to his section. Each step felt like a countdown to something he wasn't prepared for. When she reached the table beside his, Ellis cleared his throat. "Clarette." She froze, her hand still gripping the damp cloth. For a moment he thought she might bolt again, disappear into the back room and leave him sitting there with his inadequate words. Instead, she turned to face him, her blue-gray eyes meeting his for the first time in 3 years. "That's not my name here," she said quietly, "but it's still your name." She resumed wiping the table, but her movements had lost their earlier precision. "What do you want, Ellis?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they could cross. What did he want? To explain? To apologize? To somehow undo 3 years of wondering what he could have done differently? "I want to know if you're okay," he said finally. A laugh escaped her, but there was no humor in it. "Do I look okay to you?" Ellis studied her face, really looked at her for the first time since walking in. There were new lines around her eyes, subtle but present. Her skin was paler than he remembered, and there was a careful fragility in the way she held herself, like someone who had learned to be gentle with their own broken pieces. "You look like you've been surviving," he said. The honesty of his answer seemed to catch her off guard. She paused in her cleaning, her grip tightening on the cloth. "That's more than I was doing 3 years ago." The admission hung in the air between them. Ellis felt something shift in his chest. Not relief exactly, but a recognition of shared weight. He'd spent 3 years carrying the guilt of not knowing, not asking, not being brave enough to reach out when it mattered. "I looked for you," he said quietly, "after you stopped coming to work. I called, I went to your apartment, I know." Her voice was so soft he almost missed it. "I saw your messages. All of them. Then why didn't you?" "Because I couldn't." She finally met his eyes again, and he saw something there that made his heart ache. "I couldn't be the person you remembered. I couldn't pretend to be whole when I was falling apart." Ellis set down his coffee cup, the ceramic making a soft clink against the wooden table. "I never needed you to be whole, Clarette. I just needed you to be here." The words landed between them like stones dropped in still water, creating ripples neither could control. Clarette's breath caught, and for a moment Ellis saw a flash of the woman he'd known, the one who challenged his ideas, who made him laugh, who looked at him like he was worth understanding. "I have to get back to work," she said, but she didn't move away from his table. "I know." Ellis pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. "But I'm going to keep coming back. Every morning. Same time. Same terrible coffee." "It's not terrible coffee." "No," he agreed, a small smile touching his lips. "It's not." She turned to go, then paused. "Ellis? Yeah? Don't tell anyone you found me." "Not yet." He nodded, understanding completely. "Your secret's safe with me." As she walked away, Ellis noticed something he'd missed before. Despite everything, the weight loss, the exhaustion, the careful way she moved through the world, there was something different about her now, something that hadn't been there 3 years ago. She was still broken, yes, but she was also still standing. And that, Ellis realized, was the bravest thing he'd ever seen. He finished his coffee, left a generous tip, and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he heard her voice one more time. "Ellis?" He turned back. "Thank you," she said simply. He didn't ask what for. He didn't need to. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in the spaces between words, in the recognition that someone sees you, really sees you, and chooses to stay anyway. "See you tomorrow, Emmy," he said with a gentle smile. And for the first time in 3 years, Claret Monroe allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might be worth waiting for. Dr. Rachel Kemp had a theory about healing. It never happened in straight lines. "So he found you," Rachel said, settling into her familiar chair across from Claret in the small therapy office in Fort Greene. The space was deliberately calming. Soft lighting, plants that somehow thrived despite the lack of natural light, and walls painted in a warm sage green that reminded Claret of better days. "He found me," Claret confirmed, her fingers tracing the seam of the throw pillow she always held during sessions. "After 3 years of successfully hiding, Ellis James Rain walks into my cafe like it's the most natural thing in the world." How did that feel? Claret had been dreading this question since the moment Ellis left yesterday. How did it feel? Like drowning and breathing at the same time. Like being seen through a window she'd thought she'd boarded up permanently. "Terrifying," she said honestly. "But also like I'd been holding my breath for 3 years and finally remembered how to exhale." Rachel made a note in her leather-bound journal, the kind of practiced notation that never felt judgmental, only observant. At 43, Dr. Rachel Kemp was everything Claret wished she could be: grounded, confident, unafraid to take up space in the world. Her natural hair formed a beautiful halo around her face, and she wore colors that most people couldn't pull off: deep purples, rich oranges, bold yellows that seemed to generate their own light. "Tell me about the conversation," Rachel said. Claret closed her eyes, remembering. "He said he looked for me, that he called, went to my apartment. I knew that. I saw all the messages before I changed my number, but hearing him say it made it real." "Made it real," Claret agreed. "For 3 years I've been telling myself that disappearing was the right thing to do, that nobody really missed me, that I was just replaceable. And now I don't know what to think." Rachel leaned forward slightly. "Claret, what would have happened if you'd answered one of those calls 3 years ago?" The question hit like a physical blow. Claret had asked herself the same thing countless times during the darkest months, when the sertralina wasn't working yet and the world felt like it was made of glass that might shatter if she breathed too hard. "I would have broken down completely," she said quietly. "I would have told him about Caleb, about Mom, about the way I felt like I was drowning every time I tried to get out of bed, and he would have tried to fix it. Would that have been so terrible?" Yes. The answer came immediately, surprising them both with its certainty. "Because I needed to learn how to save myself first. I needed to know that I could survive without someone else holding me together." Rachel smiled, one of those rare, genuine expressions that meant Claret had discovered something important. "And have you learned that?" Claret considered the question. 3 years ago, she couldn't make it through a day without falling apart. Now she worked 40 hours a week, kept her tiny apartment clean, remembered to take her medication, and showed up to therapy twice a week. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a life she'd built with her own hands. "I'm learning," she said. "Good. Now, let's talk about what you want to do next." That was the question, wasn't it? Ellis had promised to come back tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. He'd made it clear that he wasn't going anywhere. But what did she want? "I don't know if I'm ready for whatever this is," Claret admitted. "What do you think this is?" "I think Ellis James Rain is the kind of man who sees a broken thing and wants to fix it. And I think I've spent 3 years learning that I'm not broken. I'm just different now." Rachel nodded approvingly. "That's a profound distinction. How do you think you could communicate that to him?" "I don't know. The old me would have written him a letter, outlined all my thoughts in perfect bullet points with supporting evidence." Claret almost smiled at the memory. "The new me just wants to hide in the storage room until he gets bored and moves on. But you won't do that." "No, I won't do that." The certainty in her own voice surprised her. "I owe it to both of us to at least try, even if it doesn't work out the way he wants it to." "The way he wants it to? Or the way you want it to?" Another one of Rachel's perfectly timed questions. Claret had been so focused on Ellis's expectations, on disappointing him or failing to measure up to his memories, that she hadn't considered what she actually wanted. "I want to be seen," she said slowly. "Not the person I used to be, not the person he thinks I could become again. I want to be seen for who I am right now, medication and anxiety and all. That's a beautiful thing to want, Claret, and it's also a very brave thing to ask for. As the session wound down, Rachel gave her the assignment she always gave when Claret was facing something that scared her. Write about it. Not for anyone else, not for publication, not for perfection. Just write about what you're feeling. Let the words help you figure out what you need. Walking back to her apartment that evening, Claret thought about writing. She hadn't written anything personal in 3 years, only the anonymous posts on Reddit and Tumblr, fragments of thoughts shared with strangers who couldn't judge her real life because they didn't know her real name. But maybe it was time to try again. Her apartment was small, just a studio with a kitchen barely big enough for one person and a bathroom that required creative choreography. But it was hers, paid for with her own earned money, kept clean by her own efforts. On the small table by the window sat her laptop, dusty from disuse. She opened it, stared at the blank document for a long time, then began to type. His name was Ellis, and I used to love the way he said mine. Not love like romance. Not then, but love like recognition. Like I was worth the careful pronunciation, worth the pause before and after. Like my name was something precious that required gentle handling. Today he said it again, and I remembered what it felt like to exist in someone else's mind as more than just a ghost they'd rather forget. The question is, what do I do with that kind of gift? How do you tell someone that you're grateful they remembered you, but you're not sure you remember how to be remembered? She saved the document, closed the laptop, and realized something had shifted. Tomorrow, Ellis would come back to the cafe, and for the first time in 3 years, Claret Monroe was curious about what would happen next. That, she thought, was progress worth celebrating. True to his word, Ellis came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By Thursday, it had become a strange sort of dance. He would arrive at exactly 8:47 a.m., order his black coffee, and sit at the same wobbly corner table. Claret would serve him with professional politeness, their fingers never quite touching when she handed him the cup. They would exchange maybe 3 sentences, always about the weather, the coffee, or the growing crowd of morning regulars, and then he would leave at 9:15, precisely when the cafe hit its busiest point. It was the most civilized form of torture Claret had ever experienced. You know, Marcus said on Friday morning, restocking the pastry display, that guy who comes in every day? He tips like he's apologizing for something. Claret's hand stilled on the espresso machine. What do you mean? Yesterday he left $8 on a $3.50 coffee. Day before that it was 10. Either he's terrible at math or he's trying to make up for some serious past mistakes. Or he's trying to help without making it obvious, Claret thought, feeling a familiar warmth spread through her chest. Ellis had always been quietly generous, the kind of man who would anonymously pay off a colleague's student loan or leave enormous tips for struggling servers. She'd watched him do it dozens of times during her months at Larkin Finch, never drawing attention to his kindness. Maybe he just likes good service, she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. Maybe, Marcus agreed, but his expression suggested he wasn't buying it. Or maybe he likes our barista. Before Claret could respond, the door chimed. 8:47 a.m., exactly on schedule. Ellis entered, and for the first time since this ritual began, he looked different. Still impeccably dressed in his charcoal wool coat and perfectly pressed shirt, but there was something less controlled about his movements. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and there were shadows under his green eyes that suggested he'd slept about as well as she had. The usual? Claret asked as he approached the counter. Actually, Ellis said, and then paused. He glanced around the cafe, noting the handful of early customers absorbed in their newspapers and laptops. Could we talk? Just for a minute? The question hung between them like a challenge. For 4 days they'd maintained the careful boundaries of customer and server, never acknowledging the weight of their shared history. Now Ellis was asking to step outside that safety net, and Claret felt her heart rate spike in response. I'm working, she said automatically. I know. He ran a hand through his hair, confirming her earlier observation. I have something I need to say, and I think you need to hear it. Marcus appeared at her elbow with impeccable timing. Emmy, why don't you take your break? I can handle the morning rush. Claret shot him a look that clearly communicated traitor, but Marcus just grinned and gently nudged her toward the small seating area in the back of the cafe. Ellis followed her to a table tucked between 2 towering bookshelves, the cafe's attempt at creating intimate conversation nooks. They sat across from each other, and Claret immediately regretted agreeing to this. Up close, She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his hands gripped his coffee cup like it was anchoring him to something solid. "You look tired," she said, because it was easier than asking what he really wanted to tell her. "I haven't been sleeping well," he admitted. "Haven't been sleeping well for about 3 years, actually." The honesty of it caught her off guard. Ellis had always been controlled, measured in what he revealed about himself. This version, rumpled and vulnerable, was unfamiliar territory. "Ellis, let me say this first," he interrupted gently. "Please. I've been rehearsing it for days, and if I don't get it out now, I might lose my nerve." She nodded, wrapping her hands around her own cup for warmth and comfort. "I failed you," he began, his voice quiet but steady. 3 years ago, when you were struggling, when you needed, I don't know what you needed, but I failed to provide it. I was so caught up in my own inability to express feelings, so paralyzed by the fear of saying the wrong thing that I said nothing at all." Claret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Ellis, you couldn't have known." "But I did know," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Maybe not the specifics, but I knew you were hurting. I could see it in the way you started arriving late to meetings, in how you stopped contributing ideas, in the way you seemed to be disappearing even before you actually left. And instead of asking if you were okay, instead of offering support, I told myself it wasn't my place, that we were just colleagues. We were just colleagues. No, we weren't." The certainty in his voice made her breath catch. "We were never just colleagues, Claret. And I think you know that." She did know that, had known it then, had carried the knowledge through 3 years of therapy and medication, and carefully rebuilt days. They had been something indefinable but real. Two people circling around an attraction neither was brave enough to name. "What are you asking me, Ellis?" "I'm asking for a chance to do better," he said simply. "Not to fix you. I can see you've done that work yourself. Not to rescue you or restore you to who you used to be. Just a chance to be present, to be someone you can count on, whatever that looks like." The offer hung between them, beautiful and terrifying. Claret thought about Dr. Rachel's question, "What do you want?" She wanted to be seen. She wanted to be known. She wanted to believe that it was possible to let someone in without losing herself in the process. "I'm not the same person I was 3 years ago," she said carefully. "Neither am I. I take medication. I go to therapy twice a week. I have panic attacks in grocery stores sometimes, and there are days when getting out of bed feels like climbing Mount Everest." "Okay." The simplicity of his acceptance broke something open in her chest. "I work in a cafe and live in a studio apartment with a leaky faucet and neighbors who fight at 2 in the morning. I know. I might never go back to publishing. I might never be the ambitious, driven person you remember. I'm not asking you to be." Claret studied his face, looking for signs of pity or disappointment, or the kind of misguided romantic notion that love could cure all wounds. Instead, she saw something she'd forgotten existed: genuine acceptance. "What are you asking for, then?" Ellis smiled. The first real smile she'd seen from him since he'd walked back into her life. "Coffee dates. Real ones, where we sit across from each other and talk about books and current events and whatever random thoughts cross our minds. Maybe walks in the park when the weather gets better. Conversations that last longer than 3 minutes. That's all. That's everything," he said softly. Claret felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for 3 years finally creaking open. It was scary and hopeful and completely unpredictable. Everything she'd spent 3 years learning to avoid. It was also, she realized, exactly what she wanted. "Okay," she said, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff. "But we start slow, and if I need space, you give it to me." "Deal," Ellis said immediately. "And no trying to solve my problems or manage my recovery or any of that white knight nonsense." "Understood." "And Ellis?" She met his eyes, needing him to understand this next part completely. "I'm not broken anymore. I'm just different. If you're expecting me to go back to being who I was—" "Claret," he interrupted gently. "I fell for who you were then, but I'm curious about who you are now." And in that moment she realized that maybe, just maybe, letting someone see her wasn't the same as letting them save her. Maybe it was just letting them love her. Their first real coffee date happened on a Sunday, when the rain turned Brooklyn into watercolor paintings on windows. Claret had suggested meeting at Prospect Heights Coffee instead of her workplace, neutral territory where she wouldn't have to serve him while trying to have a conversation. She arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a table near the back where she could see the entire cafe but still feel somewhat hidden. Old habits from her anxious months, when every public space felt like a potential threat. Ellis walked in at exactly 2 p.m., shaking raindrops from his dark umbrella. He'd traded his usual business attire for dark jeans and a navy sweater that made his green eyes more prominent. The casual look suited him, made him seem more approachable, more human. "You're nervous," he observed as he sat down across from her, noting how she was methodically shredding her napkin into perfect strips. "Terrified," she corrected honestly. "I haven't been on whatever this is, in 3 years. It's coffee between friends," Ellis said gently. Nothing more complicated than that. Friends. The word felt both safe and disappointing, but Claret appreciated that he wasn't pushing for more, wasn't trying to rush her into something she wasn't ready for. "Tell me about your book," she said, desperate to shift focus away from herself. "Marcus mentioned you published something that did well." Ellis's expression shifted, becoming slightly uncomfortable. "It's not that interesting." "Try me," he sighed, stirring his coffee even though he hadn't added anything to it. "It's called The Space Between Words, Understanding Human Connection in the Digital Age. Basically, I wrote about how we've become experts at communicating without actually saying anything meaningful." "That sounds exactly like something you would write," Claret said, and was surprised to find herself smiling. "Let me guess. You interviewed dozens of people about their deepest fears and somehow made it into a bestseller. Something like that?" Ellis's cheeks reddened slightly. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was writing about authentic communication, while completely failing to communicate with the one person who mattered most. The comment hung between them, heavy with implication. Claret felt her chest tighten, not with panic this time, but with something warmer and more complicated. "Is that why you wrote it?" she asked softly. "Partly. Also because my therapist suggested I channel my emotional avoidance into something productive." "You're in therapy?" Ellis nodded, his fingers drumming against the table in a nervous rhythm she remembered from their old meetings. "Started about 6 months after you disappeared. Turns out successful businessmen can be just as screwed up as everyone else." The admission surprised her. 3 years ago, Ellis had seemed invulnerable, controlled, confident, always knowing exactly what to say in every situation. The idea that he'd needed help, that he'd been struggling too, shifted something in her understanding of their dynamic. "What do you talk about?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Emotional unavailability, fear of vulnerability, the way I use work as a shield to avoid dealing with feelings." He smiled ruefully. "Dr. Morrison has a lot of theories about my childhood and my relationship with my father." "Dr. Morrison sounds like they know what they're talking about." "Dr. Morrison is terrifyingly perceptive," Ellis agreed. "She's the one who told me I needed to find you, not to win you back or convince you to return to your old life, but to apologize, to acknowledge that my silence contributed to your isolation." Claret felt tears prick at her eyes. She'd spent so many therapy sessions with Dr. Kemp working through her guilt about disappearing, about the way she'd handled her breakdown. The idea that Ellis had been doing his own work, examining his own contributions to what happened, felt like a gift she hadn't expected. "I'm sorry too," she said quietly, "for leaving without explaining, for not trusting you enough to tell you what was happening. You don't owe me any apologies, Claret. You did what you needed to do to survive." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the rain streak down the windows. The cafe was busy but not overwhelming, filled with the kind of people who treated Sunday afternoons like sacred time. Families with small children, couples reading different sections of the newspaper, students with laptops and highlighters spread across tables. "Can I ask you something?" Ellis said eventually. "Sure. What's the hardest part? About everything you've been through?" Claret considered the question. Most people, when they asked about her depression, wanted to hear about the dramatic moments, the hospitalization, the medication trials, the darkest days when getting out of bed felt impossible. But Ellis was asking about the ongoing challenge, the daily reality of living with mental illness, the uncertainty, she said finally. "Even on good days, there's this voice in the back of my mind asking if I'm okay or if I'm just pretending to be okay. Sometimes I can't tell the difference." Ellis nodded like he understood. "The book tour was like that for me. Standing in front of audiences talking about authentic communication while feeling like a complete fraud, smiling and shaking hands while knowing I was still too scared to have an honest conversation with the person I most wanted to talk to." "Is this honest enough for you?" Claret asked, gesturing between them. "It's a start." Another comfortable silence. Then Ellis surprised her by pulling out his phone and showing her a photo, a screenshot of a Reddit post. "I found this about 6 months ago," he said. The username caught my attention and the writing style seemed familiar. Claret's heart stopped. The post was one of hers, written under the pseudonym Blue-Gray Morning, a stream of consciousness piece about learning to love yourself when you feel fundamentally unlovable. "You knew it was me?" "I hoped it was you," Ellis corrected. "It gave me hope that you were still writing, still processing, still alive, I guess." "You read my anonymous mental health posts?" "I read everything you wrote. Every post, every comment thread where you helped other people work through their anxiety and depression. You were taking care of strangers while learning to take care of yourself." Claret felt exposed and seen in equal measure. Those posts had been her lifeline during the worst months, her way of connecting with other people without risking real vulnerability. The idea that Ellis had been reading them, had recognized her voice even when she was trying to be invisible, was both mortifying and oddly comforting. "That's kind of creepy, Ellis." "I know, but it was also the only way I could make sure you were okay." She studied his face, looking for signs of the controlling behavior she'd learned to recognize in therapy. Instead, she saw genuine concern and the kind of careful respect that came from understanding boundaries. "Those posts helped me figure out who I am now," she said. "Writing them, I mean. Helping other people helped me help myself. You always were a natural teacher. I'm thinking about writing again. Really writing, not just anonymous posts. Dr. Kemp thinks it might be good for me." Ellis's face lit up with genuine excitement. "That's amazing, Claret. What would you write about?" "I don't know yet. Maybe about recovery. About what it's like to rebuild yourself when you thought you were completely broken. About learning to love people while learning to love yourself. I'd love to read it," Ellis said simply. "When you're ready." They talked for another hour. About books they'd read, movies they'd enjoyed, the small details of their current lives. It felt strange and wonderful to rediscover each other this way, without the pressure of their old professional relationship or the weight of unspoken attraction. When they finally left, Ellis insisted on walking her to the subway station despite the rain. "Thank you," Claret said as they stood under the station awning. "For today, for being patient, for letting me set the pace." "Thank you for giving me a chance," Ellis replied, "for trusting me enough to try this." As her train pulled into the station, Claret impulsively reached out and squeezed his hand, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the warmth of his skin and the steadiness of his presence. "Same time next week?" she asked. "I'll be here," Ellis promised. And as the train carried her home through the rain-soaked city, Claret realized she was looking forward to next Sunday for the first time in longer than she could remember. Progress, she thought, sometimes looked like small steps taken in good company. 3 weeks of Sunday coffee dates had taught Claret something unexpected. Healing didn't always happen alone. She was learning Ellis all over again, discovering that he took his coffee black because cream made him feel sluggish, that he carried a worn copy of the collected poems of W.S. Merwin in his jacket pocket, and that he had a nervous habit of adjusting his watch when he was trying not to say something important. Today, he was adjusting his watch a lot. "You're going to break that thing," Claret observed as they sat in their usual spot at Prospect Heights Coffee. Outside, March had finally decided to flirt with spring, and pale sunlight filtered through the windows. Ellis looked down at his hands and laughed, a sound that was becoming beautifully familiar. "Doctor, Morrison says I do that when I'm avoiding difficult conversations." "What difficult conversation are you avoiding?" He met her eyes, and she saw something there that made her chest tighten, not with anxiety this time, but with anticipation. "I want to offer you something," Ellis said carefully, "and I need you to know that it's not charity, it's not pity, and there are absolutely no strings attached." Claret felt her defenses rise automatically. 3 years of scraping by had made her sensitive to offers that felt too good to be true. "What kind of offer?" "A job." The words hung between them like a challenge. Claret's first instinct was to say no, to retreat into the safety of her carefully constructed small life. But something in Ellis's expression made her pause. "What kind of job?" "Freelance editorial consulting. Working from home, flexible hours, projects you can choose based on your interest and availability." Ellis leaned forward slightly, his voice gaining confidence as he outlined the details. "We have authors who need developmental editing, manuscripts that need sensitivity reads, proposals that need refinement, the kind of work you were brilliant at 3 years ago." "Ellis, before you say no," he interrupted gently, "let me explain why this isn't what you think it is." Claret crossed her arms, but she was listening. 6 months ago, we hired a freelancer to do exactly this kind of work. She's moving to Portland next month and we legitimately need someone to take over her client list. I'm not creating a position for you. I'm offering you a position that already exists. And the fact that you know me has nothing to do with it. The fact that I know your work has everything to do with it, Ellis corrected. The fact that I know you personally just means I can vouch for your character. But Claret, I've seen your editorial instincts. You made every project better just by being involved. She wanted to believe him. More than that, she wanted to believe in herself again, in her ability to do work that mattered, to contribute something meaningful to the world beyond perfectly steamed milk and friendly customer service. I don't know if I'm ready, she said quietly. You don't have to decide today. Think about it. Talk to Dr. Kemp about it. Take as much time as you need. Claret nodded, grateful for the lack of pressure. What would the pay be like? Ellis named a figure that made her blink in surprise. It was more than she made in 3 months at the cafe, for work she could do in a fraction of the time. That's a lot of money, Ellis. It's market rate for the quality of work you'd be providing. They sat in silence for a moment while Claret processed the offer. The practical part of her brain was already calculating how much it would help. She could catch up on her rent, maybe even start saving money again. The anxious part was cataloging all the ways it could go wrong, all the reasons she might fail. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Of course. Are you offering this because you want to help me, or because you want to keep me in your life? The directness of the question seemed to catch Ellis off guard. He stopped adjusting his watch and really looked at her, the kind of look that felt like being seen all the way through. Both, he said honestly. I do want to help you because I care about you and I can see that you're ready for more than you're allowing yourself to have. But I also, yes, I want to keep you in my life. I want to see what happens when we stop being so careful with each other. Ellis, I know we're taking things slow, he continued. I know you need space to figure out who you are now, and I respect that. But I also know that I'm falling for you again. Or maybe I never stopped falling for you. And I want to be honest about that. Claret's breath caught. 3 weeks of careful friendship, of measured conversations and respectful boundaries. And now Ellis was laying his feelings out like cards on a table. You don't know who I am now, she said quietly. I'm not the same person you worked with 3 years ago. I know you still notice when someone needs an extra moment to collect their thoughts before answering a question, Ellis said. I know you still unconsciously organize your napkins by size when you're thinking. I know you still care more about whether a story is true than whether it's marketable. He paused, running a hand through his hair in the gesture she'd come to recognize as his tell for vulnerability. But I also know you're stronger now than you were then. I know you've learned to advocate for yourself, to set boundaries, to ask for what you need. I know you've done the hard work of figuring out how to live with depression instead of being consumed by it. Tears pricked at Claret's eyes. You've been paying attention. I've been paying attention for 3 years, Ellis said softly. Even when I couldn't find you, even when I didn't know if you were okay, I was paying attention to the space you left behind. Claret felt something crack open in her chest. Not breaking, but opening like a door that had been locked so long she'd forgotten there was anything beyond it. I'm scared, she admitted. Of the job, or of this? He gestured between them. Both. All of it. I'm scared that I won't be good enough anymore. That I've lost whatever instincts I used to have. I'm scared that if we try to be more than friends, I'll disappoint you or hurt you, or fall apart in ways that damage both of us. Ellis reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The first time he'd initiated physical contact since that handshake 3 weeks ago. What if you don't fall apart? He asked gently. What if you're exactly as capable and brilliant as you've always been? What if letting me care about you doesn't make you weaker but gives you another source of strength? Claret looked down at their joined hands, his long fingers covering hers, warm and steady and real. She thought about Dr. Kemp's repeated message that healing didn't mean becoming invulnerable. It meant learning to be vulnerable in safer ways, with safer people. The job offer, she said finally. Is it really legitimate? Completely legitimate. I can send you the job description, put you in touch with the woman who's leaving, whatever you need to feel confident about it. And if I take it, and if we explore this thing between us, what happens if it doesn't work out? Then we figure out how to work together professionally while being kind to each other personally, Ellis said without hesitation. I'm not going to punish you professionally for my personal feelings, Claret. I would never do that to you. She believed him. More importantly, she believed in herself enough to trust her judgment about his character. Okay, she said quietly. Okay to which part? Claret smiled, the first real unguarded smile she'd given him since he'd walked back into her life. Okay to all of it. The job, the whatever this is. But we still go slow, and I still need you to respect my boundaries. Always, Ellis promised. And if I have a panic attack in the middle of editing someone's manuscript, you don't get to swoop in and try to fix everything. Understood. And Ellis? She squeezed his hand, feeling brave and terrified and hopeful all at once. Thank you for seeing me. Not who I used to be, not who I might become, but who I am right now. Thank you for letting me stay, he replied. And sitting there in the spring sunlight with her hand in his and possibilities spreading out before them like an open road, Claret realized that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is allow yourself to be happy. The manuscript sat on Claret's small kitchen table like a dare she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. Echoes of Tomorrow by Miranda Chen, a literary fiction novel about a woman rebuilding her life after losing everything in a house fire. Ellis had chosen it carefully, she realized. Not so close to her own experience that it would be triggering, but close enough that she would understand the emotional landscape the author was trying to navigate. It had been 2 weeks since she'd accepted the freelance position, 2 weeks of paperwork and contract negotiations, and the surreal experience of having a legitimate income again. She'd already given Marcus her notice at the cafe, promising to stay until he found a replacement. The transition felt both exciting and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff while trusting that she'd grown wings. Dr. Kemp had been enthusiastic about the change. You're ready for this, she'd said during their Tuesday session. You've built a strong foundation of self-care and emotional regulation. Now you get to test how well that foundation holds up under new challenges. What if I'm not as good as I used to be? Claret had asked. What if you're better? Now, staring at the 300-page manuscript, Claret was about to find out. She made herself a cup of tea, arranged her notes and colored pens the way she used to during her Larkin Finch days, and opened to page 1. The smell of smoke never really leaves you. Even years later, even after your clothes have been washed a dozen times and your hair has grown out and been cut again, you carry it with you like a ghost that refuses to be exorcised. Claret paused, pen hovering over the page. The writing was good, beautiful actually, but something about the rhythm felt off. She read the sentence again, then grabbed her notebook and wrote, "Consider breaking the second sentence. The list structure is effective, but might be more powerful with varied sentence lengths." As she continued reading, something magical happened. Her editorial instincts, dormant for 3 years, began to wake up. She found herself noticing the places where the pacing dragged, where character motivations needed clarification, where beautiful language was doing the work of plot advancement instead of letting the story breathe. She worked for 4 hours straight, longer than she'd focused on anything in years, and when she finally looked up, the sun had moved completely across her small apartment. Her notebook was filled with observations, suggestions, and the kind of detailed feedback that had once made her valuable to authors and publishers alike. I can still do this, she thought, and the realization felt like a gift she'd given herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ellis. How's the first day going? Instead of the usual anxiety she felt when receiving unexpected messages, Claret found herself smiling. Better than expected. This author has a beautiful voice. She'll be thrilled to hear that from you. Dinner tonight? I know a place that makes excellent Thai food and doesn't mind if you bring work notes. Claret hesitated. They'd been careful about their relationship progression. Coffee dates were safe, public, time-limited. Dinner felt more intimate, more like a real date. But she was feeling good about herself today, confident in ways she hadn't experienced in years. Okay, but I'm buying my own food. Deal. Meet you at 7? It's a date, she typed, then immediately deleted it. See you at 7. The restaurant Ellis had chosen was perfect. Small, warm, with soft lighting that made everyone look like they were having the best conversation of their lives. He was already seated when she arrived, looking up from his own work with a smile that made her stomach flutter in ways that felt both familiar and entirely new. You look happy, he observed as she sat down. I am happy, Claret realized, surprising herself. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be good at something. You were always good at things. You just forgot for a while. They ordered pad thai for him, green curry for her, and Claret found herself talking about the manuscript with an enthusiasm she hadn't felt in years. Ellis listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that reminded her why she'd been drawn to him professionally, long before she'd been drawn to him personally. Miranda is lucky to have you as her editor, Ellis said. She's been struggling with this book for 2 years. 3 previous editors couldn't help her find the heart of the story. What do you think the problem was? I think they were trying to make her write a different book instead of helping her write her book better. Claret nodded, understanding completely. That's the difference between editing and rewriting. A good editor makes the author's voice clearer, not different. Exactly, and you've always been exceptional at that. The compliment settled warmly in her chest. For 3 years, she'd defined herself by her limitations. What she couldn't handle, couldn't do, couldn't be. It felt revolutionary to be seen for her capabilities again. Can I tell you something? Ellis said as they waited for their food. Always. Watching you light up talking about that manuscript, and it's the most beautiful thing I've seen in years. Claret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Ellis, I know we're taking things slow, he continued, and I respect that completely. But I need you to know that this, he gestured between them, isn't just about nostalgia or some idealized version of who you used to be. I'm falling for who you are right now. The woman who takes medication and goes to therapy and works incredibly hard to take care of herself. The woman who's brave enough to start over, to try again, to let people in despite everything that's happened. Claret's breath caught. She'd been so focused on whether she was ready for a relationship that she'd forgotten to consider whether she was worthy of one. Ellis was looking at her like she was something precious, something worth waiting for. I'm scared, she admitted. Of what? Of disappointing you, of not being enough, of falling apart at the worst possible moment and taking you down with me. Ellis reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture that was becoming natural between them. Claret, I've been in therapy for 2.5 years learning how to be emotionally available to another person. I've done the work to understand that love doesn't mean fixing someone or being responsible for their happiness. I want to be with you, not save you. What's the difference? Being with you means supporting you while you save yourself. It means celebrating your victories and holding space for your struggles without trying to eliminate them. It means loving you as you are, not as I think you should be. Tears pricked at Claret's eyes. Where did you learn to say things like that? Dr. Morrison is very good at her job, Ellis said with a smile, and I had a lot of motivation to get better at this. Their food arrived, providing a natural pause in the intensity of the conversation. But as they ate, Claret found herself studying Ellis with new eyes. This wasn't the emotionally unavailable man she'd worked with 3 years ago. This was someone who had done his own hard work, who had learned to be vulnerable and honest and present. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Anything. What do you want from this? From us, I mean. What does success look like to you? Ellis considered the question carefully. I want to know you, he said finally. Really know you. I want to hear about your therapy sessions and your writing projects, and your random thoughts at 2 a.m. I want to cook dinner with you and argue about books and figure out how to navigate disagreements without shutting down or pulling away. He paused, his thumb tracing circles on her hand. I want to love you in ways that make you feel more like yourself, not less. And I want to build something together that's stronger than either of us could create alone. Claret felt something shift inside her chest. A door opening, a wall coming down, a space being created for possibilities she'd thought were lost forever. That sounds terrifying and wonderful, she said quietly. It does, doesn't it? Ellis? Yeah? I think I'd like to try. His smile was radiant. Yeah? Yeah. But we still go slow. And I still need you to be patient with me while I figure out how to be in love without losing myself. I'll be as patient as you need me to be. As they walked back to her apartment that evening, Claret's hand tucked securely in Ellis's, she realized something had fundamentally changed. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't just surviving. She was choosing to live. The panic attack hit Claret on a Tuesday morning while she was grocery shopping. 3 weeks into what had been the best month of her life, she was reaching for a bag of coffee beans when suddenly the fluorescent lights felt too bright, the music too loud, the crowds too close. Her chest tightened like someone was slowly turning a vice around her ribs. Her hands began to shake, and the familiar sensation of drowning while standing perfectly still washed over her. Breathe, she told herself, gripping the shopping cart handle. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. But the breathing technique that usually worked felt useless against the wave of panic. A woman bumped into her cart, apologizing quickly, and Claret felt like she might collapse. She abandoned her cart in the coffee aisle and walked quickly toward the exit, her vision tunneling as the anxiety crested. Outside, she sat on a bench and called Dr. Kemp's emergency line. It's Claret, she said when the voicemail picked up. I'm having a panic attack at the grocery store and I can't. She hung up, feeling foolish and defeated. 20 minutes later, Ellis found her still sitting on the bench outside the supermarket. "Hey," he said gently, sitting down beside her. "Dr. Kemp called me. She was worried when she couldn't reach you back." Claret looked at him through tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. "You gave her your number?" "You gave her my number. Last week, when you updated your emergency contacts. Remember?" She did remember vaguely. It had felt like such a normal, healthy relationship step, adding her boyfriend to her list of people who could be called in crisis. Now it felt humiliating. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For what? For falling apart. For needing to be rescued. For proving that I'm still—" "Stop," Ellis interrupted gently. "You didn't fall apart. You had a panic attack, which is something that happens sometimes. You called for help, which is exactly what you're supposed to do. And you got yourself to a safe place, which shows incredible self-awareness." Claret wanted to believe him, but the shame was too heavy. "I was doing so well. The editing work, the relationship, feeling normal again. And then my brain just broke." Ellis shifted closer to her on the bench, not touching but present. "Can I tell you about the panic attack I had last month?" She looked at him in surprise. "You had a panic attack?" "In my office, during a board meeting. One minute I was presenting quarterly projections and the next minute I couldn't breathe. I had to excuse myself and spend 20 minutes in the bathroom doing breathing exercises. What triggered it? The same thing that probably triggered yours. The fear that all the progress I've made isn't real, that I'm still fundamentally broken, that I'm going to disappoint everyone who believes in me." Claret felt something ease in her chest. She'd been so focused on her own healing journey that she'd forgotten Ellis was on one too. "What did Dr. Morrison tell you? That recovery isn't linear. That having a panic attack doesn't erase 3 years of growth. That the goal isn't to never have difficult moments. It's to have better tools for handling them when they come." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching people go in and out of the grocery store. Normal people doing normal things, probably completely unaware that someone was sitting 20 feet away feeling like their world was collapsing. "I keep waiting for you to realize this is too much work," Claret said quietly. "What do you mean?" "Dating someone with anxiety and depression. Having your Tuesday morning interrupted because your girlfriend can't handle buying coffee beans. Having to be someone's emergency contact when you didn't sign up to be a caregiver." Ellis was quiet for so long that Claret started to worry she'd finally pushed him too far. Then he spoke, his voice careful and thoughtful. "Do you remember when I told you about my book tour?" "Yeah. There was a signing in Chicago where this woman came up to me afterward. She was probably in her 60s, very put together. The kind of person who asks thoughtful questions during Q&A sessions. She told me that she'd been married to her husband for 40 years, and that he'd had bipolar disorder for 30 of those years." Claret listened, not sure where the story was going. I asked her if it was hard, if she ever regretted choosing to love someone who struggled with mental illness. And she looked at me like I'd asked the strangest question in the world. She said, "Everyone comes with something. Some people have anxiety. Some people have diabetes. Some people are just assholes who never learned to be kind. My husband is funny and generous and brilliant, and he also happens to have a brain that works differently than mine. I didn't fall in love with his mental health status. I fell in love with him." Ellis turned to face Claret more fully. "I'm not dating your anxiety, Claret. I'm dating you. The anxiety is just something you live with, like my tendency to overthink everything, or my complete inability to remember where I put my keys. It's not the same thing, Ellis. You're right. It's not. Your anxiety is bigger and more challenging than my absent-mindedness. But the principle is the same. I'm choosing to love all of you, not just the easy parts." Claret felt tears starting again, but these felt different, cleaner somehow. "What if it gets worse? What if I have more bad days than good days? What if—" "Then we'll figure it out together," Ellis said simply. "That's what people do when they love each other. They show up for the hard stuff." They walked back to her apartment together, stopping to pick up the groceries she'd abandoned. Ellis didn't hover or treat her like she was fragile, but he stayed close enough that she felt supported without feeling suffocated. Later that evening, as they sat on her small couch eating takeout and watching a mindless comedy, Claret's phone rang. Dr. Kemp returning her call. "I'm okay now," Claret told her therapist. "Ellis found me and we talked through it." "Good. That's exactly what your support system is for. How are you feeling about what happened?" Claret looked at Ellis, who was pretending not to listen, while very obviously listening. "Embarrassed, frustrated, but also grateful, I guess. That I have people who show up when things get hard. That's healthy thinking, Claret. Can we schedule an extra session this week to process this a bit more? Yeah, I'd like that. After she hung up, Ellis looked at her with a gentle smile. How are you really doing? Better. Still shaky, but better. She curled up against his side, marveling at how natural it felt to seek comfort from him. Thank you for not making this about you. For not getting frustrated or scared or… Claret? Yeah? This is what love looks like. Showing up for each other when things get difficult. Not just during the pretty, Instagram-worthy moments. She pressed her face against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the detergent he used on his shirts. I love you too, she said quietly, even though that terrifies me. The loving me part, or the admitting it part? Both. All of it. The way you make me want to be braver than I think I am. Ellis pressed a kiss to the top of her head. You're already the bravest person I know. Even when I fall apart in grocery stores? Especially then. Do you know how much courage it takes to ask for help when you're struggling? To trust someone enough to let them see you at your worst? Claret tilted her head up to look at him. When did you get so wise about feelings? When I realized I might actually get a chance to love you properly this time, Ellis said. I had a lot of motivation to figure out how to do it right. And sitting there in her small apartment, with her anxiety medication on the kitchen counter, and her therapy appointment scheduled for Thursday, and this man who somehow loved her exactly as she was, Claret realized something profound. Healing didn't mean becoming perfect. It meant learning to be imperfect with grace, surrounded by people who understood that love wasn't about fixing each other. It was about choosing each other, broken pieces and all. 6 months later, Claret was sitting in Ellis's office at Lark & Finch, staring at a proposal that could change everything. Lark Soul, she read aloud from the document spread across his mahogany desk. A new imprint dedicated to authentic voices in mental health, recovery, and resilience. Ellis watched her face carefully, his hands folded in front of him in the gesture she'd come to recognize as barely contained excitement. What do you think? Claret read through the proposal again, her editorial mind automatically noting the strong market research, the compelling mission statement, the carefully projected financials. But it was the last page that made her breath catch, a list of potential inaugural titles that included one entry in particular, What Remained in Silence, by Claret Monroe, a memoir. You want me to run this imprint, she said quietly. I want us to run this imprint, Ellis corrected. You as editorial director, me handling the business side, a partnership. Ellis, I can't. Before you say you can't, let me tell you why I think you can. He leaned forward, his green eyes intense with conviction. In the past 6 months, you've edited 12 manuscripts. Every single author has requested to work with you again. Miranda Chen just signed a 3-book deal based partly on your developmental notes. You've built a reputation for editorial excellence that has publishers calling us specifically to request your services. Claret felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd been so focused on taking things one project at a time that she hadn't stepped back to see the larger picture of what she'd been building. But more than that, Ellis continued, you understand this market in a way that no one else does. You've lived the stories these authors are trying to tell. You know the difference between authentic representation of mental health struggles and exploitative trauma porn. You can guide writers toward truth instead of sensationalism. What about my own book? She asked, pointing to the proposal. I haven't even written it yet. So write it. The simplicity of his response made her laugh. Just like that? Just like that? You've been writing pieces of it for months. In your therapy journals, in those posts you still write anonymously. In the conversations we have about your recovery process. You just need to put it all together. Claret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan street scene below. The view was different from her old office, higher up facing a different direction, but the energy was the same, the sense of possibility, of stories waiting to be told, of words that could change lives. I'm scared, she admitted. Of which part? All of it. Running an imprint, working in an office again, being responsible for other people's careers, writing a memoir that exposes everything I've worked so hard to heal from. Ellis joined her at the window, his presence warm and steady beside her. What would Dr. Kemp say about that fear? Claret smiled despite herself. She'd ask me what the fear is really about, whether I'm afraid of failing or afraid of succeeding. And which is it? Both. She turned to face him. What if I succeed beyond my wildest dreams and then have a breakdown? What if being back in this world triggers all the old pressures that made me leave in the first place? What if it doesn't? Ellis countered gently. What if you've built enough tools and support systems that you can handle success differently this time? What if the woman you are now is strong enough to navigate challenges that would have broken the woman you were 3 years ago? The questions hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Claret thought about the conversation she'd had with Dr. Kemp just last week about post-traumatic growth, the idea that sometimes people don't just recover from trauma, they actually become stronger and more capable because of what they've survived. There's something else, Ellis said quietly. Something I need to tell you before you make your decision. Claret felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. What? The board approved this proposal 3 months ago. We've been waiting for the right moment to offer it to you. 3 months, Ellis? Why didn't you? Because I wanted to make sure you were ready. Not just professionally, but emotionally. I didn't want to pressure you into something you weren't prepared for. Claret studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. Instead, she saw the careful respect that had characterized their entire relationship, his willingness to let her set the pace, to make her own decisions, to choose her own level of risk. You really think I can do this? I know you can do this. The question is whether you want to. What do I want? The question Dr. Kemp had been asking her for 3 years, and the answer kept evolving. 3 years ago, she'd wanted to disappear. 2 years ago, she'd wanted to survive. 1 year ago, she'd wanted to heal. Now, looking at the proposal for Lark Soul, feeling the familiar thrill of editorial possibility, imagining the stories they could help bring into the world, Claret realized what she wanted had expanded beyond mere survival. I want to help other people tell their stories, she said slowly. I want to create space for voices that usually get marginalized or sensationalized. I want to prove that books about mental health can be literary and commercial and transformative. That sounds like a yes. That sounds like a terrified yes. Ellis smiled, the kind of smile that made her remember why she'd fallen for him in the first place. The best decisions usually do. 3 hours later, they were sitting in a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy, celebrating with wine and pasta, and the kind of giddy excitement that comes from jumping off cliffs together. So when do we start? Claret asked, twirling linguine around her fork. Officially, January 1st, but we can start building the catalog now, reaching out to agents, developing our launch strategy. And my book? Write it at whatever pace feels right. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be true. Claret nodded, feeling a familiar flutter of creative energy she hadn't experienced in years. The urge to go home and write, to finally tell her story in her own words, to transform her pain into something that might help other people feel less alone. Ellis? Yeah? Thank you. For seeing me as more than my diagnosis. For believing I could do this before I believed it myself. Thank you for letting me be part of it. For trusting me with your dreams. As they walked home through the October evening, Claret's hand warm in Ellis's, she thought about the conversation they'd need to have with Dr. Kemp, about managing stress in high-pressure environments, about the strategies they'd need to develop for handling the inevitable challenges of working together as romantic partners, about the vulnerability required to write a memoir about mental illness while building a career in publishing. But tonight, none of that felt overwhelming. Tonight, it felt like the next chapter in a story that was finally moving towards something hopeful. Hey, Ellis? Yeah? I love you. Even when you spring life-changing career opportunities on me over lunch. I love you too. Even when you overthink every decision for 3 hours before saying yes. We're quite a pair. We really are. And walking through the city that had once felt like too much to handle, Claret realized that sometimes the most radical act of recovery is allowing yourself to want something bigger than just getting by. Sometimes it's allowing yourself to dream again. The manuscript was finished on a Tuesday morning in February, exactly 2 years after Ellis had first walked back into her life. Claret sat at her new desk in the Lark Soul offices, a bright, airy space with plants and comfortable furniture that felt nothing like the sterile corporate environment she remembered from her first stint in publishing. She stared at the final page of her memoir, the cursor blinking after the last sentence she'd written, and in learning to love myself, I remembered how to let others love me too. 312 pages. 18 months of writing, revising, crying, and ultimately healing in ways she hadn't expected. The book had been more difficult to write than any editing project she'd ever taken on, forcing her to relive moments she'd spent years learning to process in therapy. But it had also been the most honest thing she'd ever created. A soft knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Ellis peered in, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the cautious expression he always got when he wasn't sure if she was having a good writing day or a hard one. How did it go this morning? he asked, setting one cup on her desk. I finished it. Ellis paused, his own coffee cup halfway to his lips. You finished the book? I finished the book. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 3 years of growth, 18 months of vulnerability, and the kind of completion that felt both triumphant and terrifying. How do you feel? Ellis asked gently. Claret considered the question. How did she feel? Exhausted, certainly. Proud, unexpectedly. Scared about putting her story into the world. Absolutely. But underneath all of that was something she hadn't felt since before Caleb died. A sense of wholeness. I feel like I finally know who I am, she said quietly. Ellis sat down in the chair across from her desk, the same chair where dozens of authors had sat over the past 8 months, discussing their own vulnerable stories with her. Lark Soul had officially launched 3 months ago with 5 books, and they already had a waiting list of authors who wanted to work with them. Can I ask you something? Ellis said. Always. What was the hardest part to write? Claret didn't have to think about it. The chapter about Caleb, about the guilt I carried for surviving when he didn't, about how I convinced myself I didn't deserve to be happy because he'd never get that chance. And what was the easiest? The chapter about finding you again, about learning the difference between being saved and being supported. Ellis smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made her remember why she'd fallen for him before she'd even known she was falling. There's something I need to tell you, he said, and Claret felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Good something or bad something? Good something. Great something, actually. He pulled out his phone and showed her an email. HarperCollins wants to make an offer on your book. A significant offer. Claret blinked at the screen, reading the numbers twice to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. That's a lot of money, Ellis. It's what your story is worth. What your voice is worth. She set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. They want me to do a book tour, speaking engagements, media interviews. Only if you want to. We can negotiate any terms that make you comfortable. Claret stood up and walked to her office window, looking out at the Manhattan street below. 3 years ago, the thought of being in the public eye would have sent her into a panic attack. Even now, the idea was daunting. But it was also exciting in a way that surprised her. I want to do it, she said, turning back to face Ellis. The tour, the interviews, all of it. I want to talk about mental health and recovery and what it really looks like to rebuild your life. I want other people to know they're not alone. Are you sure? I'm terrified. But yes, I'm sure. Ellis stood up and crossed to where she was standing, pulling her into his arms. I'm so proud of you, he murmured against her hair. Not just for finishing the book, but for becoming the person who could write it. Claret pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne and the detergent he used on his shirts. Everything felt different now than it had 2 years ago. Steadier, more real. Ellis? Yeah? I have something to tell you, too. He pulled back to look at her face, and she saw a flicker of concern in his green eyes. I had lunch with Dr. Againℹ yesterday, Claret said. We talked about my progress, about how much I've grown, about the tools I've developed for managing my mental health. Okay. She thinks I'm ready to graduate from twice-weekly sessions to once a month. Ellis's expression shifted from concern to pure joy. Claret, that's incredible. It doesn't mean I'm cured, she said quickly. It doesn't mean I'll never have panic attacks or bad days or moments when the depression tries to convince me I'm worthless. It just means I've learned how to live with those things without being consumed by them. That's the most beautiful definition of recovery I've ever heard. They stood there for a moment, holding each other in the light streaming through her office window, and Claret marveled at how far they'd both come. Ellis had done his own work in therapy, learning to be emotionally available and communicative. She'd done hers, learning to be vulnerable without disappearing, to accept love without losing herself. There's one more thing, Ellis said, his voice suddenly nervous. What? He stepped back from her and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that made Claret's heart stop. Ellis, before you panic, he said quickly, this isn't a proposal. Not yet. This is a promise. He opened the box to reveal a simple silver ring with a small blue stone that matched her eyes. I know we're not ready for engagement, Ellis continued. We're still figuring out how to be partners in business and in life, but I wanted you to have something that reminds you that I'm not going anywhere, that whatever challenges come up, bad days, book tour stress, the inevitable complications of working together, I'm choosing to stay. Claret felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they were purely happy tears. It's a promise ring? She asked, laughing through her tears. It's a promise ring. Very mature and adult of me, I know. It's perfect. She held out her right hand, and Ellis slipped the ring onto her finger. I love you, Ellis James Rain, even when you make me cry at work. I love you too, Claret Elise Monroe, even when you finish books and change our entire lives before noon on a Tuesday. As Ellis kissed her in her sun-filled office, surrounded by the books they'd helped bring into the world, Claret realized that the story she'd been trying to write for 3 years was finally complete. Not the memoir, though that was finished too, but the story of her own life. It wasn't a story about being saved or fixed or returned to some previous version of herself. It was a story about transformation, about learning to love the person she'd become through surviving the unthinkable. It was a story about what remained in silence and what happened when you finally found the courage to speak. What we build, after 1 year later. The book signing at the Barnes & Noble in Union Square was supposed to end at 8, but at 9:15, there was still a line of people waiting to meet Claret Monroe. She sat at a small table surrounded by towers of her memoir, What Remained in Silence, wearing a navy blue dress that made her feel confident and professional without being uncomfortable. Her ash-brown hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and the promise ring Ellis had given her caught the bookstore's warm lighting as she signed copy after copy. Thank you, said the woman currently standing at her table, mid-40s, with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly as she held her book. Your chapter about panic attack, it made me feel less alone for the first time in years. You're not alone, Claret replied, meeting the woman's eyes. And seeking help isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing you can do. From across the bookstore, Ellis watched her with the same expression of quiet amazement he'd worn for months now. His Claret, brilliant, resilient, beautiful Claret, had become someone who helped strangers feel less broken just by sharing her own story of putting herself back together. The book had been on the New York Times bestseller list for 6 weeks. Lark Soul had 17 titles scheduled for the next 18 months. Claret gave 3 speeches a month about mental health advocacy and had just signed a deal for her second book, this one about the intersection of creativity and healing. But what struck Ellis most wasn't her professional success. It was the way she moved through the world now, grounded, present, unafraid to take up space. She still took her medication religiously, still saw Dr. Kemp once a month, still had days when her brain told her lies about her worth. But she'd learned to recognize those lies for what they were, and she'd built a life strong enough to withstand them. She's remarkable, said a voice beside him. Ellis turned to see Dr. Rachel Kemp approaching, elegant in a burgundy blazer and gold jewelry that caught the light when she moved. She really is, Ellis agreed. Thank you for helping her become who she is. I didn't help her become anyone, Dr. Kemp corrected gently. I just helped her remember who she'd always been underneath the trauma. The last person in line was a teenage girl, maybe 16, clutching a worn copy of the book. Ellis could see her nervousness from across the room, the way she kept shifting her weight, the careful way she'd styled her hair to cover what looked like self-harm scars on her wrists. Hi, the girl said quietly when she reached Claret's table. Hi there. What's your name? Madison. I read your book 3 times. My mom got it for me after she gestured vaguely toward her arms. After my therapist said it might help. Claret's expression softened in the way it always did when she met someone who reminded her of herself at her lowest point. How are you doing now, Madison? Better, some days. It's hard, but I'm trying. That's all any of us can do, Claret said, signing the girl's book. Keep trying one day at a time. She wrote something else on the title page before handing it back. Madison read it and burst into tears. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when someone gives you exactly what you need to hear. What did you write? Ellis asked later, as they walked hand in hand through Washington Square Park. Your story isn't over yet. The best chapters are still being written. Ellis squeezed her hand. That's what you told yourself, isn't it? During the worst of it. Every day for 2 years, Claret confirmed, even when I didn't believe it. They found their favorite bench, the one where they'd had their first real conversation about the future, where Ellis had first told her he was falling for the woman she'd become, rather than mourning the woman she used to be. I have something to tell you, Ellis said, and Claret felt the familiar flutter of anxiety before remembering that his surprises were always good ones now. Good something or potentially life-changing something? Potentially life-changing something. He turned to face her more fully. Netflix wants to option your book for a limited series. Claret blinked. They want to turn my memoir into a TV show? They want to turn your memoir into a 6-part series about mental health, recovery, and what it really looks like to rebuild your life. They're specifically interested in the relationship between trauma and creativity, and how love can be part of healing without being a cure for everything. That's incredible, Ellis. But also terrifying. You don't have to decide anything tonight, or this week, or this month. But I wanted you to know that your story is reaching people in ways we never imagined. Claret leaned back against the bench, looking up at the city lights filtering through the tree branches above them. A year ago, the idea of her story being adapted for television would have sent her into a panic attack. Tonight, it felt like a gift, another way to tell people they weren't alone, that recovery was possible, that broken things could become beautiful when handled with care. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always. Do you ever miss the way things used to be? When we were just colleagues with a mutual attraction we were too scared to act on?" Ellis considered the question seriously, the way he always did when she asked him something important. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," he said finally, "but I wouldn't trade what we have now for anything. Back then we were both too afraid to be real with each other. Now we get to love each other knowing exactly who we are. Anxiety, therapy sessions, book deadlines and all. Even when I wake up at 3 a.m. convinced that everyone will hate my next book, especially then. That's when you need me most." Claret smiled, remembering the conversation they'd had just last week when her imposter syndrome was particularly loud. Ellis had made her tea, listened to her fears without trying to fix them, and then reminded her of all the letters she'd received from readers whose lives had been changed by her words. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too." "Ellis? Yeah? I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" Claret smiled, feeling brave and settled and sure of herself in ways that used to seem impossible. "Ready for you to ask me the question you've been wanting to ask for 6 months." Ellis's eyes widened. "How did you—" "Because I know you, and because Dr. Kemp asked me last week if I thought I was ready for that kind of commitment, and when I said yes without hesitation, I realized you'd probably talk to her about it." Ellis laughed, running a hand through his hair in the gesture she'd come to love. "Dr. Morrison suggested I get input from your therapist before making any major relationship decisions. Something about supporting your partner's mental health framework. Very mature and thoughtful of you both. So when you say you're ready, I mean I'm ready to build a life with you. Ready to be partners in every sense of the word. Ready to love you and let you love me without being afraid that I'll lose myself in the process." Ellis reached into his jacket pocket, and Claret realized he'd been carrying the ring for months, waiting for the right moment to ask. "Claret Elise Monroe," he said, dropping to one knee right there on their bench in Washington Square Park. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said immediately, before he could even get the ring box fully open. "Yes, absolutely yes." As Ellis slipped the engagement ring onto her finger, a simple solitaire that caught the light from the street lamps, Claret thought about all the versions of herself she'd been over the past 4 years. The broken woman who'd disappeared from her own life, the scared woman who'd hidden behind someone else's name, the healing woman who'd learned to trust again, and now, this woman, confident, successful, deeply loved, and finally ready for whatever came next. "You know what the best part is?" she said as Ellis sat back down beside her, both of them grinning like teenagers. "What? Our story isn't about you saving me or me completing you or any of that romantic nonsense. It's about 2 people who did the work to become whole on their own, and then chose to build something beautiful together. That's a much better love story," Ellis agreed. "The best kind," Claret said, and kissed her fiancé under the New York City stars. Later, as they walked home to the apartment they'd been sharing for 6 months, the light-filled space in Brooklyn Heights with room for both of their books and a writing desk positioned to catch the morning sun, Claret thought about the girl she'd been at 27, so afraid of her own feelings that she'd convinced herself she didn't deserve love. That girl could never have imagined this life, successful, creative, surrounded by people who saw her mental illness as just one part of who she was rather than the defining characteristic. Engaged to a man who understood that love wasn't about fixing each other, but about choosing each other every day, especially on the difficult ones. She still went to therapy. She still took medication. She still had days when her brain lied to her about her worth and her future. But she also had a career that mattered, a voice that helped others, and a love that made her feel more like herself rather than less. Standing in their kitchen, watching Ellis make tea while telling her about the author he'd met with that day, Claret realized that recovery had never been about returning to who she was before. It had been about becoming who she was meant to be all along, Someone brave enough to be broken, strong enough to heal, and wise enough to know the difference. "What are you thinking about?" Ellis asked, handing her a steaming mug. "Just gratitude, I guess, for all of it. Even the hard parts that brought us here. Even the panic attacks and the 3 years of silence and the grocery store meltdown. Especially those," Claret said, and meant it completely. "They taught me that I could survive anything, and that I didn't have to survive it alone." Ellis smiled and pulled her close, and Claret thought about the final line of her memoir, the words that had taken her 18 months to write and a lifetime to understand. "And in learning to love myself, I remembered how to let others love me too." It was, she realized, the most honest thing she'd ever written. It was also just the beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.